Now that we have introduced third declension nouns, in this video we're going to introduce third declension adjectives along with adjectives that show comparison and superlatives. These are called comparative and superlative adjectives respectively. The good news is that we're not going to have any new paradigms or any new forms to memorize. Rather, everything that's going to be presented in this video is going to be new concepts using forms already known and sort of grafting these new concepts onto older concepts that you have already learned about adjectives in particular. And we're going to introduce one very important adjective of the third declension and the different uses of it. This is the adjective that is pos in the nominative masculine singular, πᾶσα in the feminine nominative singular, and πόν in the neuter nominative singular. So if you remember back to when we introduced adjectives, we said that at its most basic level, an adjective is a word that describes a noun. And this is true of adjectives in all languages. In Greek, an adjective is going to agree with the noun that it modifies in three different things. The first is case, the second is gender, and the third is number. So unlike pronouns, which only agree with the noun they match or their antecedent in gender and in number, an adjective is going to match the noun that it goes with in case, gender, and number in all three of those things. So we saw this example with respect to second declension adjectives earlier in the semester. Ha, kalos, logos, the good word, or we'll never see something like ha, kalu, logos. So this, of course, is what case? That's right, the genitive case. And logos is what case? That's right, the nominative case. So you'll never have a genitive adjective modifying a nominative noun. This adjective is always going to match the word that it's modifying, as it does over here. We have the definite article in the nominative masculine singular, the adjective in the nominative masculine singular, and the noun in the nominative masculine singular. And we have said again previously that most adjectives have three different inflections, that they are going to look different for the masculine, for the feminine, and the neuter. We call these three termination adjectives. That is, they have three different endings, three different terminations. In this case, we have os of the second declension ending, the a of the first declension ending, and the on of the second declension neuter ending. So here the example, hey, agathe, graphe, to get us a feminine first declension example in here. And we also talked previously about a smaller subgroup of adjectives that only have two terminations or two different endings. An example of this is adunatos, adunaton. And in this case, adunatos, this first one, covers both the masculine and the feminine forms. And this ending covers the neuter forms. And what we're going to do is introduce today a different set of adjectives. So those are all adjectives, or those are all concepts that we should already be familiar with. These are what we call 2-1-2 adjectives, namely second declension, first declension, second declension adjectives. That is, they take their masculine endings in the second declension, they take their first declension endings in the feminine, and they take their neuter endings in the second declension. So 2-1-2 adjectives are the group of adjectives that we have already seen, though at that time we did not give them this name. This terminology is new, but the concept here is not new. So most adjectives for the feminine are always going to take first declension endings. The exception is on that last slide, the two termination adjectives that don't have a separate feminine form, where the sort of second declension masculine form covers the feminine. In that case, the feminines don't have their own separate first declension endings. So here we see, once again, a paradigm we've already seen before, the paradigm for agathos, which is a 2-1-2 adjective, a second declension in the masculine, a first declension. So notice all these endings here are first declension endings in the feminine, and then second declension in the neuter. And this lines up with those figures that we have as our mnemonics for the different declensions. So swain Ionisus is our figure for the second declension ending. So you see swain, ion, esus here in these endings. So this is why it's 2 there. And then these first declension endings roughly line up with asina, ionisas. And then over here are neuter endings, besides the rule about the nominative and accusative being identical to one another and different from the masculine. We see these ones lining up with the sort of middle part of our mnemonic there. And so we have those kinds of adjectives that we've already introduced, and we're going to introduce, we've already covered, I should say, and we're going to introduce in this video a new set of adjectives that use those third declension endings that we learned previously with respect to nouns. So whereas some adjectives are going to take second declension endings in the masculine and the neuter, another group of adjectives are going to take third declension endings in the masculine and the neuter, and these are called 3-1-3 adjectives, and they take their name from the fact that they take third declension masculine endings, they take first declension feminine endings, and third declension neuter endings. So you see 3-1-3 here. So if we look at what this looks like, in our prime example of a 3-1-3 adjective is going to be pās, pāsa, pon, the word for whole, all, or every. And you can see how sasia esonsias lines up with the endings of our pās paradigm here in the masculine. So that this is following, these endings are following the third declension. We, of course, as always in the third declension, have the most irregular forms in the nominative singular and in the dative plural. And the reason for that in this case is that the new tau of the root pont, so remember to find the root of a third declension noun or an adjective in this case. What you do is you look to the genitive singular and you take off that os ending. So we remove that os and we find that pont is the ending, and then we can go back and add sasia esonsias. But when we add the sigma of the nominative singular and the dative plural, some changes happen, and this is true in most words of the third declension. With respect to pont, when you add this sigma here, the nu and the tau really don't like to be next to a sigma, so they will just drop out and leave us with pās for the nominative singular and then pásen for the dative plural, that the new tau has dropped out for each one of those. So what we have then is the third declension here in the masculine, and then also over here in the neuter, remembering this rule that the neuter nominative and accusative are identical to one another. That's the case here with pon and ponta and they differ from what we have in the masculine. So the neuter is also third declension, so we have 3 and 3, and then in the feminine we have first declension endings following our mnemonic asina ionisas. So we have that here with asin, and then if we had the vocative here, it's not on the paradigm, we would have another alpha here. So asina's first name, the alpha in her first name, would be here in the vocative, but we don't have the vocative here. And then ionisas at the going down in the plural here, so that we have these first declension endings is what this 1 represents up here. So that pās, pāsa, pon follows a 3-1-3 paradigm, where its endings in the masculine and the neuter are in the third declension, and its endings in the feminine are in the first declension. And so here what I've done is, just for your reference, taken these basic endings of the third declension. So you see I note that here with third, and then the basic endings of the first declension, and sort of separated them out just so you can see how they map onto the pās, pāsa, pon paradigm here. And so if those are our forms, we need a little bit more explanation of how the third declension adjectives relate to other nouns and other adjectives. And so remember that an adjective is always going to be listed with its various endings, in its various forms or terminations in a vocabulary list or in a lexicon. So that with pos, pos, upon, what you'll find is that it's listed this way in the vocabulary. So that pos is always the masculine, passa is the feminine, and pon is the neuter. So with other adjectives, you're going to see this as well, where 3 different words are listed, or sometimes a word then with the dash and the ending listed, like this, a dash with an ending. And what this is telling you is that the first one is the masculine, the second one is the feminine, the third one is the neuter, and then that those are declined according to the respective 3-1-3 paradigm. And it's really important to recognize that adjectives are not going to ever change their declension. If an adjective is a third declension adjective, it is always going to be a third declension adjective. It will never be a second declension adjective. It won't follow those second declension adjective endings. It will always use those third declension endings. So an adjective is not going to change the endings it has based on the noun that it modifies. So for example, if we wanted to say the whole word with the adjective from pos, the inflected form of pos in the genitive singular, pontos is our genitive masculine singular form of pos. And so if we want to modify a genitive masculine singular noun, lagu, in this case a second declension noun, we do that still in the third declension. So even though these endings don't look the same as one another, we have an os and an u ending, this is actually a genitive masculine singular ending. And remember, always the definite article, if it's before, is going to be your friend, that you're going to be able to recognize the parsing information from the definite article here. So these match in case, gender, and number, because remember, adjectives will always match the noun that they modify in case, gender, and number, even though they don't look the same. So what we have is a third declension adjective, pontos, with a second declension noun, lagu. And we can see this different ways the other way as well, where with tu agathu archontos. So agathu here is a second declension adjective with a third declension noun. So archontos, even though it has this os ending, is not nominative masculine singular, it's genitive masculine singular, following the third declension ending here. And the u is second declension genitive masculine singular. And once again, the tu at the beginning, the definite article there, is always going to be the tried and true way to find the parsing information for a word that may not necessarily look as you might expect it to look. So this is a genitive masculine singular. This is a genitive masculine singular, even though they look different from one another. A second declension adjective with a third declension noun. And so this is going to be the case that an adjective will match the noun it modifies in case, gender, and number, even when the noun and adjective are not of the same declension. So we've seen this going on right up here. And so what I want you to do is our first quick quiz for this video here. Go ahead and grab your whiteboard and answer these 5 questions here. 3 true or false, and then 2 identification questions at the end there. All right, so your answers should look something like this. If they do, let's go ahead and high five, or even if they don't, let's go ahead and high five. 1, 2, 3, boom. And so for our first one, an adjective matches the noun that it modifies in gender and number, but not necessarily in case. This is false. An adjective is going to match the thing that it modifies, the noun that it modifies, in case and in gender and in number. Next question, an adjective always matches the noun it modifies in declension. False. You can have an adjective of the second declension or the third declension modifying an adjective or a noun of the opposite, the second or the third declension. That is to say, a third declension adjective can modify a second declension noun and vice versa. And a little bit of review here. A pronoun matches the noun it modifies in gender and number. And the better way to actually say this question, matches its antecedent in gender and number, but not necessarily in case. And this is true, that the pronoun, the word to which it refers, its antecedent that has appeared in the previous context, it'll match in gender and number, but its case is dependent on its function in the clause. And then in this phrase that we saw in the last slide, to pontos lagu, which one's the third declension? It's our adjective pontos in the genitive case. Same question right here. This time the noun is in the third declension, also in the genitive case. And over here, the adjective is in the second declension. In this example above, the adjective is in the noun, is in the second declension. So once again, here we have our forms of pās, pāsa, pān, and let's get a little bit more on these particular adjectives. The particular adjectives, pās, pāsa, pān, and then the forms by which they are also inflected here. So there are going to be 4 different uses of pās, pāsa, pān. And these are sort of generalized uses, pās, pāsa, pān, and all of its forms are a sort of really flexible word that you'll find it gets translated. You'll need to translate it different ways in the New Testament, but this is to boil it down into sort of the 4 most common uses of pās, pāsa, pān and its equivalents here. So when it's in predicate position, and remember predicate position is when the article does not directly precede it, but does precede the noun. So you'll have something like a form of pās, article, noun, or a separate construction, article, noun, and then a form of pās will be translated all. So the predicate use is translated all, as in pāsa he polis, all the city. When pās, pāsa, or pān is in the attributive position, that is, the article comes right before it. So you'll have something like article, form of pās, pāsa, pān, and then noun, it's going to be translated whole. So here, he pāsa polis, the whole city. So using our same words, but shifting pāsa down after the definite article changes from all the city to the whole city. When a phrase is anautherous, that means there is no article in the phrase at all, as in pāsa polis. It's going to be translated every city. And then lastly, when there is no noun that a form of pās, pāsa, or pān is modifying, it's functioning substantively. So remember, we've come across this use of other adjectives quite often, that it can stand alone in any case, depending on its function in a sentence, and function like a noun. So it's standing on its own, not modifying another noun. Some of the most common of these in the New Testament is going to be panta, all things. So this is the neuter, nominative, or accusative plural. And then another very common one, which I didn't type out here, but is going to be pantes, in the nominative masculine plural, meaning every one. So these are both going to stand on their own, not modifying another noun in this sentence, and are going to be functioning as the noun themselves. So what I want to do here is we have another matching here. Let's number these to make it a little bit easier for what you're going to do on your whiteboard. And what I want you to do is match the number. So just go ahead and write 1, 2, 3, 4 on your whiteboard with the letter that goes with it. I've taken away the Greek here from the previous slide and given you different words. And I want you to match these up with these over here. So your answer should look like this, B, D, A, C. If that's what you've got, let's go ahead and go in for the high five. 1, 2, 3, boom. And so let's get a translation of each one of these really quick. B is going to be pon, ta, soma. So here we have the article not preceding the form of pas, pasa, or pon, but the article just preceding the noun, meaning all. And remember, soma means body, so all the body here. Number 2 is going to be di, ta, pon, soma, where the article precedes both the form of pon and soma, and it's going to mean whole, so the whole body. And then 3 is going to be a here with no article at all present, and an authoress construction, meaning every body, not everybody, every one that exists, but every body, every physical body. And then 4 here is going to be C, the substantive use, just meaning all things. So it's standing on its own, not modifying another noun in the sentence. And next, we need to talk about the so-called comparative adjectives and superlative adjectives. And to do this, first, I want to introduce us to how English does comparison and how English does superlative adjectives, because these might be grammatical concepts that you may not remember, or you're probably familiar with, very familiar with, because you use them regularly, but you're not often describing them. You're not often talking in grammatical terms about how you make comparatives or use superlatives. So English has 3 different degrees of comparison. The positive degree, and here I give us an example, 3 different examples: hard, beautiful, or good. So this is sort of the basic form of an adjective, what's called the positive form. And then the comparative form, the comparative degree, is one step up from that: harder, more beautiful, better. And the highest degree, which is why we have the name superlative, which means highest, is hardest, most beautiful, or best. And I give us these 3 different examples because they represent different ways that English forms the comparative and the superlative. So you'll notice that with hard, harder, hardest, we have the adding of ER and the adding of EST as a regular way of making the comparative degree. This is also true with the addition of more or most. So this one adds directly to the adjective itself, and this is, of course, adding a word before the adjective. Irregular comparison is when a word changes altogether to make its different degrees. So good goes to better in the comparative, a whole different word altogether, and then a third different word altogether for the superlative degree, best. And in English, what we do to make a comparison between 2 things is we really like this English word than, that will use the comparative form harder than a rock, or more beautiful than a prince, or something like this. That than is sort of our key word for the translation of the comparative degree, and really also the superlative degree in some cases. I'm trying to think of a good example here, and I'm not going to think of one. So let's more closely associate, because I'm drawing a blank here, we're going to more closely associate the comparative in English with than we are going to the superlative here. So than is often going to be our key word in English for comparatives, and that being the case, it's going to be our key word when we translate Greek comparatives into English. And so what I want to do here is we're going to put up here the way that Greek does comparison in ways that are similar to and different from English. So we're going to follow the same structure that we did in that last slide. Greek is likewise going to have 3 different degrees of comparison: the positive degree, the comparative degree, and the superlative degree. And I've only given us 2 examples here, but you will see that there is once again regular and irregular forms of comparison. That with the positive degree, dikaios, which means righteous, to form the comparative degree, more righteous in English, or righteous-er, if we want to maybe do a little bit of improper English there, or non-prescriptive English, I should say. What you do in Greek is add on this ter bit right in here, and I'll pull that out in just a second here on another slide. And then to form the superlative degree, you add in that tot in there. These are the regular ways of making the comparative and the superlative respectively. But there are also, in Greek, irregular ways of doing comparison. And this is the case with an adjective like agathos. Agathos goes to a different word, krason, in the comparative degree to mean better. And then a third different word, kratistos, to mean best in the superlative degree. So I told you that I was going to get these things on a different slide. Apparently I have them on this slide right here. So our regular comparative is going to be teros, tera, teron. And this corresponds to the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter forms. So these are the different terminations or the different endings for a comparative adjective. And notice, because these are comparative adjectives, they're going to change not only for their gender, so these are representing the different genders in the nominative case, but they're also going to inflect for different cases and number. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment here. So it's not as if there's only 3 forms of this comparative adjective. There is actually, the full 24 forms that reflect going down the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative in the singular and in the plural. And this is also the case for tatos, that we have tatos, tate, taton for the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter respectively in the nominative. So these all represent the nominative, and then you can think of the paradigm sort of going down from them. And that is going to look like this. And so this may look overwhelming to you because there's a lot on here. We have 2 different paradigms of 24 words each. And you're not being asked to memorize this, as I said at the beginning of the video here. But notice that these are following 2, 1, 2 endings. So these are second declension endings. These are first declension endings. And these are, again, second declension endings. So that you see Swain, Ionissus in here. So these endings should actually be quite familiar to you. So even though there's a lot here on the screen and on the paradigm, the recognition of them should be quite easy because you'll recognize those endings. And then what you really have to do is see the ter or the tot inside and recognize that as the comparative or the superlative respectively. And so that's what I tell you right here, is that the real key to identification of the comparative or the superlative is going to be this ter with the inflected ending added on to it, or the tot then with the inflected ending indicating case, gender, and number following ter or tot respectively. And so the last thing, if we said that English likes to use the word than for the comparative degree, Greek does this in 2 different ways that will usually translate with the English word than. The first is to put the thing that is being compared in the genitive case after the comparative word. So, for example here, dikaiateros autou. More righteous. So dikaiateros means more righteous. This is the comparative form of the adjective dikaios in the nominative masculine singular. And then more righteous, and when we see a genitive, we normally sort of default to of him, more righteous of him, but that of course doesn't make sense. And the genitive is here because it's the object of comparison. And so we translate that with the English than, more righteous than him. The other way Greek will do this is by using the this little word a. And it's hard to see there because it's so small, but I want to show you much larger the accent and the breathing mark here. So it's a smooth breathing mark, not a rough breathing mark. So it's not hey, and we have the accent. If we were not to have the accent and we were to have the rough breathing mark, this would of course look like what? That's right, the feminine definite article. This is a different word than that. This is the word that roughly corresponds to the English than. And when Greek uses this word, when it uses a, what it will do is it will have a comparative adjective, then it will have a noun, then it will have that little word, and then it will have another noun in the same case. So over here we have the humans loved, and then malon is going to be our comparative word, our comparative meaning more. And in this case, we're going to do more than, because we always want to get that English word than in there for the comparative. Ta skatos, a ta phos. Notice how ta skatos and ta phos are both in the same case here. They're both accusatives, and here they're both accusatives, neuter singulars. So the humans loved the darkness more than the light. So this is the second way that Greek will make a comparative clause, is by having the two things that are compared to one another directly connected by this little word e. And so let's do one more quick quiz here. There's 5 of these, so go ahead and write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on your whiteboard. And you're going to want to maybe give yourself a little space because some of these are going to, one of them is going to ask you to explain, and a couple of them are going to ask you to list things. But go ahead and write down your answers to these 5 questions here. And I would really encourage you, it's easy to skip over doing things like explaining in writing when we're not together, when I'm telling you to do it virtually over YouTube. But there is a real value of explaining in writing what you have learned. It really helps it stick better. So I strongly encourage you to actually do this and not skip over this one. So go ahead and pause and answer these 5 questions here. All right, you should look something like this. Number 1, our English word we normally use is than. The two things that are going to come after a comparative in Greek are either something in the genitive case, the object of comparison in the genitive case, or we'll see this little word e. Explain the difference between irregular and regular comparatives or superlatives. A regular, reg here, not new word, will not have a different word altogether, but will be formed with these endings: teros, tera, teron, and tatos, tate, taton, and then inflected for case and number. And then a sort of review, a throwback to our basic endings of the third declension. We have sasia, esonsias.